haven't already exited your hotel room, please keep that in mind. Our first talk this morning is Lies, Damned Lies, and History. Rachel Fulton Brown. She is an American medievalist, associate professor of medieval history at the University of Chicago, specializing in the study of devotion, prayer, and the works of Tolkien. She has authored various texts on the topic of Christian studies and the Middle Ages, and recently she taught a class in alt history. So we're all going to get to be her students in an abbreviated version of that class this morning. Please welcome Rachel Fulton Brown.
So, you didn't tell them what my other books are. I write big, fat books, not just little poetry books. This class is intended for third-year undergraduates. I assume most of you are older than that. Therefore, I am going to assume that you know something about history, but if you have not studied history, you're in for a bit of a wild ride. I have Hans here to help me be a student. So maybe I should actually like introduce the class as I would, and then you get to, okay, good. All right. So you all know the meme, right? There's historian, it's the meme, and there's 6 pictures, and it's like what my friends think I do, what my mom thinks I do, what society thinks I do, what the university thinks I do. That when the professor's just lecturing to the students, right? What I think I do, which is cool stuff in the archives. What I actually do is sit in stacks of papers and stuff. Add, however, to this, what you guys think I do when you ask me for advice on the accuracy of the historical bit in your novels. Rob, where is he?
There's a reason I did the introduction this morning, and we'll leave it at that.
Well, no, I mean, so he did. Rob calls me up. He's going to write this book about the Crusade, and we're going to talk a little bit about, like, what sources should I look at? And you know, the idea being, oh, I'll ask the historian, she can give me references, I'll go read those books, and I'll know what happened.
That's how it works, isn't it?
It's complicated. You've heard of fake news. Let me introduce you to fake history. All of it. So this is the course. I didn't call the course fake history. I call it alt history because, of course, we are on the alt of everything. And the point was to introduce these third-year history majors in the practice of writing history. Now, if you've taken the first or second year courses in history, right, if you did distribution requirements or something, because I know most of you aren't historians, you're engineers or something like that, physicists. You will have studied history in the introductory context in which we give you narratives, assign you some sources, show you, look, these sources support those narratives, and you go off thinking that's what we do. That's not what we do. We write narratives, and therefore you should be in this room, because many of you are storytellers, more familiar with this practice than you realize. It, of course, is not simply a matter of finding the facts and then putting them into your story, because the narrative determines which facts you are looking for. Okay, so far so good, right? It's like, I want to tell the alternate history of the American Civil War or the American Revolution or something like that. That would mean, oh, I'm going to go find new facts that other people haven't paid attention to. And this is usually what undergraduates and those of you not studied history as you know, at this practice level do. You think, I'm going to fill in a gap that nobody has ever thought of dealing with this question. Now, in fact, that to some extent that happens, and even at the graduate level, people are often to this point where they're saying, I'm going to go, you imagine yourself going to the archive, finding the manuscript that, it's manuscripts because we're medievalists, the manuscript that nobody has ever seen, and like the Codex Babylon, Rob. Is. I mean, this is the stuff off which most medievalist historical fantasies are built. There's the researcher. I'm thinking of the Witches trilogy. What's her name? They made a movie. They made a BBC series off of it, right? You're in the library looking at the manuscript that nobody has ever seen, and your piece of the story is the thing that clicks and flips it all. Well, one, you're never going to find that manuscript unless it's been cataloged, which means somebody's seen it before, right? And it's not usually a situation of finding the text that nobody has seen or the clue that nobody's found, or archaeologists occasionally find stuff that nobody's seen for a while. But usually, what you're doing is writing into a narrative that you recognize has been told in a particular way that you now are contesting, and you can do that with exactly the same facts as have been out there all along. This is troubling for many people because history is supposed to be the stable backdrop against which novelists, historians make up stories, not the shifting sands of reality itself. I have some bad news. It's turtles all the way down. And this is, I've had outside my office door for some time now a quote from Scott Adams, who is currently in his online persona discovering turtles all the way down constantly. But he should have known better, because he said this in his Dilbert persona. Those who do not study history are doomed to repeat the things that appear in history books but never actually happened.
Well, I just wanted to interject. Norm Macdonald has pointed out that in the history books, luckily the good guys always win. And what are the odds of that? Right?
0. Actually, 1. There's one book in which the good guys win. That's the story against which I tell mine, right? But so yes, the point being, you should already be suspicious when, your version of history, you're on the side of the good guys. And this is, I have some test cases to work through, how far Hans lets me go. Depends on how canceled you really want to get, right? Because recognizing, I was sort of pointing to this yesterday a little bit, most of what I'm doing in my ventures into the public sphere is saying, look, guys, the story, there's more to it than maybe you think, and maybe you aren't the good guys. So the 3 cheers for white depends on which tribe you belong to. In the sense of, yes, whose story are you? And this is in fact why everyone keeps getting canceled, because you're being canceled when you challenge someone else's narrative. And we throw that word around very easily, like narrative. Oh, there's a narrative. Oh, you're going to believe it. Everyone is in a narrative because you've told yourself a story about why things are the way they are. And that story, well, it's like, why is history so hard to get right? And these are my principles that I ended up for the student's final paper. If you're curious, I can show you the prompt that I gave them, but after they've been working with me for 9 weeks on this, and saying, why is it so hard to get right? You have to consider these 5 layers of the problem. 1, history as we practice it as storytellers is always dependent on previous tellings of the story, aka historiography, right? It's like, and this is what you'll when you're in first or second year classes in history, we're not really showing you the problem of the historiography. We're saying, oh, look, here's the current interpretation, here's the evidence that fits it, here you get to test how our current interpretation is right. What you'll find out if you start doing research, however, is, you're the first turtle, right? And there's turtle, the previous tellings of the story, which your generation is contesting. Well, that turtle was standing on another turtle that had its story. It's standing on another turtle that had its story. And graduate students in particular, when we go through orals fields before they get to the research part, have to read through the historiography of a field, and it's going to have switched back and forth several times, or up and down the turtle tree, right? You might find that turtle is the right turtle for the answer. The narrative is always dependent on previous tellings of the story. That's where the good guys problem comes in, right? Second, it's always dependent on theology, aka theories of causation, epistemology, how we know what we know, and meaning. It's like we practice in history the retellings problem, the historiography problem a lot. We do not practice as a profession the theological problem, and therefore everybody gets mad at me. No, that was seriously my opening cancellation after I started blogging about Milo. Was I was asked to write a piece for the University of Chicago Divinity School on why Milo's Dangerous Faggot Tour 2016-2017 on campus was so explosive. And what I said was, you know, in a nutshell, universities were originally founded as places where we disputed theology. We need to practice these kinds of debates because otherwise everybody gets upset and the violence flows out into the street. Well, everybody got upset with me. Guess who got most upset with me? The Divinity School. And I said, I don't get this. I'm actually showing that what you're doing is the most important, discipline we have. And of course they got upset with me because they said, oh, she's hateful. And I'm like, oh, this was my introduction to this whole problem. It's like, I wasn't being hateful. I was saying we need to practice. And they said, you're hateful. You want us all to be Christian. And I'm like, well, I do actually want you all to be Christian, but I want to explain why. Right. And it's the Divinity School. I thought they didn't, endorse this problem of, how do we explain our actual premises of reality. History is dependent on those much more than you'd realize, and we may get to that in more practice demonstration. Third, we came up with this a bit in the graphic novel. I mean, it's always dependent on the media in which the evidence appears, right? The medium is the message. Marshall McLuhan is a genius. He's also a bit mystical and trained too much in medieval studies, and therefore makes no sense to people who are not mystical and trained in medieval studies, because he's showing the way in which the writing itself is the first alt, right? It's like you've translated oral experience into this fixed medium. Printing has another effect. The radio and telegraph. Hans gave me a great book last year, very highly recommended, on the Victorian internet, which is on the telegraph. If you think we're having problems now, look at the 19th century, right? Look at First and Second World Wars, our radio phenomenon, and terrifying because of the effect of the voice speaking out over the war. Sauron is speaking from a radio tower, I am now convinced. What Travis said about how we're in the internet now and the explosiveness and the fear and the transformation, McLuhan understood all of this, and we as historians have to understand the degree to which our evidence is already participating in that. I took him to the special collections and showed them a variety of books, and they got that a little bit. One of them was the fancy version of Mein Kampf we have in the library collection. It's giant and it's bound in white leather. And it's the visual of this book is intense because it's clearly meant to make a particular statement on the basis of the printed medium in which it appears. Fourth, history is so hard to get right because it's always dependent on who is telling the story. What people lazily call bias, the students all know to look for this. Your bias. It's like, but it's better understood as you and whose empire. Right. Your bias is going to be fundamentally grounded in the empire that you belong to. I belong to the empire of our Lord Jesus Christ, which means I would say I have a privileged perspective on some of these worldly empires that tend to being the historiography, particularly from the 19th century, is celebrating certain empires. One of them is the British one. Therefore, as we will now demonstrate in some of our examples, Anglophone scholarship has a bias towards us being the good guys because it's in our language. If you habla español, maybe your empire is a little different. And therefore, your version of the story on who the good guys are and whose empire's mythology you are participating in is going to be quite powerful. And five, it's always, history is so hard to get right because it's always dependent on what people already care about. Better said as the myths they live by. Now, if you are already anxious, I've tread on some of those for you, right? And that this is my professional training is to get you in the dojo of historiography to practice that feeling. I said I was a fencer. I meant it. I've been fencing for, not professionally, just amateur, but competitively for 20 years now. And the first thing you have to learn to do is control your emotions, because you are going to have someone coming at you with a claim that makes you feel anxious. And I've been practicing saying I'm Christian a lot, right? You say that. One of the things Christians aren't good at is but I don't want to have to believe anything. And you're already in the presence of a myth, of a reality, a challenge that you have to practice. Americans have the same problem. We're being hit right now in our current lived moment with some narratives that we're going to have to really, really think hard about. Right? If you're convinced that you know who the good guy and the bad guy is in that conflict that's going over in Eastern Europe, you're in the midst of one of those stories. These are why it's so hard to get right. And it's fundamentally, I mean, it's the previous tellings, your theories of causation and meaning and knowledge, the media that you're working with, whose empire you participate in, and your own emotions. Ready to test?
All set.
Do you have did you have some? So we have some tests.
Well, so long as you don't tell me that George Washington didn't really chop down that cherry tree, demonstrating his honesty.
The 19th century is responsible for most of the myths that we live by, and that one, I'm not sure where the cherry tree one comes from, but
Weems.
Well, what I know is Washington Irving's mythologies. For example, if you're absolutely convinced that Christopher Columbus had to sail the ocean blue to prove the world was round, you are in the midst of a myth that Washington Irving very effectively created by way of pretending to be a historian, because he went and studied in the archives in Spain and came out with this, set piece drama where Columbus has to go to the doctors at Salamanca and demonstrate to them that they're wrong. Oh, these Christians that believe the earth is flat. No, nobody ever did. Read Dante, it's round. What the center is, well, that, we can debate. But it's large, much of what, you have mythologies about our great heroes. You got to look back to the storytellers, and they've created them. One of our very most powerful historiographers to create my entire field is Mark Twain, who, thanks to Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, convinced everybody in the English-speaking world that the Roman Church invented slavery in Britain.
Well, let me ask about Tartaria, because I've been seeing a lot of stuff on Tartaria online, and there are all these old maps that show Tartaria prominently displayed all across Central Asia, and we have all of these ancient buildings that have technologies that have been lost and forgotten. With
some technologies you work on, like electric generators,
with their antennas grabbing the etheric energy out of the sky. And even you conventional historians have to admit that we've discovered, like, the Baghdad batteries that were clearly a battery cell that may have been used for electroplating. So
you're going to tell me the cathedrals are cathode ray generators?
Absolutely. I saw it online.
Yes, online.
And they have antennas. It's on the internet.
With pictures.
The pictures are very and they're historical pictures. They're black and white, so they're true.
And they've deceived us, right? It's like all of this. If you've never heard of Tartaria, clearly it's because, well, Tartaria is where is Tartaria? Where was it?
Central Asia.
Russian?
Basically. But you historians have covered up the secret
We have,
truth.
and we apparently also don't know our own chronology, because of, it's like Jesus actually lived in the 12th century of our current counting, and all of this entire story has been completely hidden, and it's all in this book, which you can also buy from the internet, although he published it and made it open source and stuff, and so all of it's proof, all of the pictures. There was an empire covering Asia and extending into North America that's been wiped out by modernity. Well, this may be true.
Well, I mean, you can see the pictures of the elaborate classical structures that, the cities that had been built that were discovered by the pioneers. And then they invented something called World's Fairs, where they pretended that they had built them in just 18 months. And then at the end of the fair, they destroyed the evidence by tearing them all down. And we have photographic proof that you can see for yourself that they were there and that those advanced civilizations and cities were present until they were torn down and the historians covered up the evidence.
So, just wrap the bullshit needle detector needle completely around the tag about 6 minutes.
That's the point.
There are pictures.
There are pictures, right? And this is We had one of those fairs in Chicago, right? Don't you know? Those buildings weren't stone. They say they burned down because they were wood and plaster and just painted over and stuff. No, they were stone buildings that were purposefully destroyed so that. The problem is, of course, we have this tower at the University of Chicago that looks just like a 14th century tower built in Oxford, where C.S. Lewis was a don, right? Magdalen College, we've got that tower there. And you know that there's stories of King Arthur about how he was the emperor of all of the ancient kingdoms, and probably traveled all the way to North America and came in a Viking ship. We have photographs of that Viking ship that showed up at in Chicago, allegedly in this 1893 World Fair. Clearly, because we have that medieval tower at the University of Chicago built, and it's a absolute echo of the tower that's built in Oxford at Magdalen College. King Arthur made it to North America. I think Rob did a book on Vikings, right? So the first exercise I had the students do, we started with Tartaria, which first I had them prove that it was all true, right? So they had to pick something from this account, like the World Fairs or the mud floods or the star forts, the energy forts, to make them aware of the fact that just because there's lots of pictures out there and you can put them into a narrative and create a chronology out of it, and there's maps labeled Tartaria, which there are, which is the Mongols, but in our conventional story, of course. That I wanted them to have an exercise of saying, once you've got all of this evidence thrown at you, watch yourself putting pieces of the puzzle together, and you can create. I mean, there are people on the internet there. I've listened to some of the guys who are talking about the World Fairs argument here. I didn't remember who they are, but that they've absolutely convinced themselves that these are alternate histories that they've been covered up and wiped out because of the interests of the present. And the students found it relatively easy to do the exercise the next week, which was to disprove these narratives. But a lot of energetic people on the internet are still persuaded that this is an actual historical revision. Well, that was easy.
Well, surely you're not going to tell me that King Arthur and his noble knights didn't really exist, and that Merlin didn't put all the stones. I mean, we have Stonehenge. I mean, that's got to be proof, even for you skeptical historians, that mystical, magical forces were at work in ancient Britain. And we have the stories of King Arthur and his knights.
Well, yeah, I mean, Stonehenge is there. We have Glastonbury, too, where they found the tomb of Arthur in the late 12th century. Yeah.
So with all that evidence, who can deny it?
Well, are you sure we have evidence? Whose evidence do we have of King Arthur?
I read it in a book.
I had this experience. This is horrible. So the main source of story that we have for King Arthur is Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, which is marketed by Penguin Classics as, I don't know, it's in the classics, right? It's a history book, and on the back of it, it's like, the history of the kings of Britain. And I've had the sad experience of standing in a bookstore with this young couple, and I'm like, I'm not going to discourage them from reading, but this is too much. And they're reading the back cover of Geoffrey Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. They're saying, and they want history, right? They want the full narrative. It's chronological. It starts with the Romans. It starts with Troy. Why Britain is called Britain?
No, why?
Brutus, who comes from Troy, right? And Britain is named after Brutus, and this is well established in the Middle Ages, right? There's the Brut, which is written in Middle English, which is the entire story of how Brutus flees from the fall of Troy and comes and founds his kingdom in Britain. And by the time you get to King Arthur, that's basically modern history. British history went on for thousands of years, from the fall of Troy through the conquest of the Romans to Old King Cole and King Lear comes out of that story, right? And that all of these stories that we've lost of the ancient history of the kings of Britain, and this couple was reading the back of the Penguin Classic and saying, we should read this.
But how can you account for the success of the British Empire if you deny that Britain wasn't the home of the Holy Grail?
He's jumping ahead, right?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Because Hans has actually done his homework and said, so we have, why am I skeptical about King Arthur? Well, Geoffrey of Monmouth writes the History of Kings of Britain in the 1130s. Remember what I said about history always being written to support an empire? Whose empire is Geoffrey Monmouth writing History of the Kings of Britain in the 1130s supporting? Class, do you know your English history? Well, the Normans have already established themselves. Good. That's in 1066, and they, of course, wipe out a lot of the Anglo-Saxon history. So we wouldn't know, because make sure that as a conqueror you wipe out your previous. But then, well, so William is hated so much that when he dies, his body is abandoned and it blows up before they manage to bury it, and it's very ugly, and it's at Caen. His sons managed to first not have enough children, and then have so by the 1130s there's a contested succession, and one is Henry I's daughter, Empress Matilda. She's the Empress of Holy Roman Empire because she married into it, and Stephen, who is the son of the Count of Anjou, and they're in contest over who should be the rightful heir. And then Geoffrey comes along, and he's, of course, of mixed marriage. He's both Norman and Welsh, probably. And he's going to write a story in which it's appropriate for the daughters to inherit the kingdom, like King Lear's daughter, right? So this is all, you are already with Geoffrey Monmouth in the presence of one of these narratives that's in support of an empire, but in this case, it's Empress Matilda's story, right? So this becomes, even in the 12th century, there's contests that one of my guys who I've worked on a lot, William of Newborough, who is more famous in my scholarly context for writing a commentary on the Song of Songs, in which he makes the bride and the bridegroom in the narrative Christ and Mary in conversation. It's very beautiful. I wrote a whole book on this problem. He contests that Geoffrey made up the history. Now, you see what just happened there, right? William thinks of himself as a historian, gives historical reality to the relationship between Christ and his mother through the scriptural commentary, but knows that Geoffrey had to have made up all of that stuff about King Arthur because it's not in Bede. Now, Bede was, of course, writing in the 8th century. I told you it was turtles. Right? Bede is writing in the 8th century to prove the legitimacy of the English church, Anglo-Saxon church, as against, the British church. And of course, Bede doesn't have any of these stories of King Arthur, because why would he? Because he's writing the Anglo-Saxon story about how Augustine came to Canterbury and converted Ethelbert of Kent, and among other things, brought this beautiful book, it's illustrated book with a comic series in it, of the Gospels. And you know whose coronation that was carried in recently?
King Charles?
King Charles, right? All the medievals got excited over my Charles and, the regalia and the hidden version of the anointing and such. There's the book that was brought to England from Italy, the Augustine of Canterbury's Gospels, on a pillow. It's on if you look at this, it's like proof of what? Now, this Grail thing, what are you talking about, this Grail? What's a Grail?
The Holy Grail of Christ that he drank from at the Last Supper.
What? How? What? Tell me more about this Grail.
I read about. Now that's in the Bible.
There's a story in the Bible about a supper. Mm-hmm. Is there a story about a Grail?
Oh, yeah, of course. That's there. That's the cup that he drank from, the wine, the blood of Christ.
And you think that we have this object?
It's in the pictures. We can see them. It's in the pictures.
Why do you think this Grail is something real?
That I saw it. Yeah, it was in the movie too.
Is in the movie?
Yep, it's in the movie. It's
There's
in the picture.
Story?
Even
choose wisely.
The ancient chroniclers had pictures of it.
Right. Well,
and they even put it on top of the castle to attract knights. I mean, I saw that story too.
Well, I mean, interestingly, I don't think Geoffrey had a story about the Grail in his Arthurian. I mean, he has a story about Arthur having this empire and fighting the Romans and maybe coming to North America with his fleet. But there's no Grail in Geoffrey.
He must have just missed that part.
How many of you want to find the Grail? Are you sure it exists? Not anymore, right? Okay. So with the next stage in this exercise, my student, we're heading for the Spanish Inquisition. You realize, which I'm sure you all think was real. Geoffrey is so successful that people wrote stories into his universe. right? Including, I mean, it's the greatest, Jeffrey is the greatest generator of fan fiction after Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And he is, and I work on the fan fiction of the authentic story. Thank you very much. But Jeffrey is so successful in making Arthur such a character that other people come along and write stories. And one of them is Chrétien de Troyes, the Christian of Troy. He's probably a convert, interesting, which is why his name's Christian. So he's the Christian of Troy, and he writes in French a story of Parzival, who finds, the Fisher King who's wounded and, doesn't ask the question about the Grail, which is being carried in a procession. And it's this flat serving platter with flames coming out of it, right? Very cool object, which I'm sure you all want to now find. Well, my colleague Joseph Gehring did a book on the Virgin and the Grail and said he found the Grail that Chrétien was inspired by in a painting in northern Spain, in a representation of Christ in majesty, and the Virgin with the apostles at the bottom is holding this flaming dish. There's a number of other frescoes like this, the Romanesque, that have her, sometimes she's holding something that looks more goblet-y, but in the one that Chrétien's patron was most closely associated with, probably because of the families, and the French are down there in Spain worrying about their empire in the early 12th century. Chrétien takes this picture of this flaming holy dish and puts it in his story. You guys do this all the time, all right? Wolfram von Eschenbach comes along and he writes this version in German, but he's going to tell a better story. And his Grail is modeled on another object that he saw probably in Bamberg at the cathedral. Is a portable altar, right? We've gone from a painting of a dish with flames in it, so it's the consecrated something, to an actual portable altar, which has a green stone on top. Parzival's Grail is green. And it flows with water, right? There's images of the waters of paradise on this portable altar. My colleague at Georgetown, Ron Murphy, says, I found the gemstone of paradise is this portable altar. And I had my students debate which of these stories they like better, and just to test how well they were able to understand the proof that was shown there. And I said to them at the end of it, you realize if these guys are right, and you're sort of satisfied that we found the stimulus for the story of the Holy Grail, it never existed. Right? It's an artifact that it'd be like if you read that book that we're not being able to honor the author of and found the Codex Babylon, right? If you actually believed Rob after he talked to me and he read some history and he was accurate in his details, created an object that he wanted to make the centerpiece of his story, and now you are out there on quests trying to find the real codex of the demons. Oh dear.
But it was such a good story.
Nobody expects.
Oh, is that my cue? Now,
you're going to tell me you believe in this?
Well, I hope you're not going to tell me that the Spanish weren't the evil empire that was, unapologetically following the Catholic tradition that we noble Protestants had reformed and become the enlightened rebels pursuing the real truth of God and recognizing individual rights and opposing the tyranny of the evil Spanish Empire in its attempt to spread its heresy throughout the New World.
If you've been paying attention, you should be able to unpack this story. You could start, right? Why did they? How many people did they kill? I mean,
lots and lots. And they sent the Inquisition after anyone who dared defy their tyranny.
I read on the internet that it was millions.
Millions?
Millions. 50 million. That was the most I'd ever seen.
Well,
right?
it's on the internet.
It was in my chat, in my Telegram chat with a guy coming in and saying, the Catholics you need to answer for all of these martyrs. And he made a list, and some of them weren't even dead, right? So Peter Waldo, he actually, we don't know how he died. What? Maybe. I don't even know what those are. He's saying John Wycliffe. You know how evil the church was with the Wycliffites, right? You know how John Wycliffe died? A stroke, right? We have one, and this is why I say I live according to the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ in the story, and I'm also a medievalist who grew up Presbyterian, which is I've therefore been practicing this alt history quite diligently my whole life, including doing things like reading William of Newborough, the arguer with Geoffrey Monmouth about how to read the scriptures, because we in the Anglophone world believe a terrible alt story. I was thinking, it's like you've all read my Wikipedia entry now, right? You know how dangerous I am. I'm sure you've read Blaine's. Does Blaine Pardo have a Wikipedia entry? We can prove with evidence that that's not the case. That maybe I did say some things that got a few people in the medieval history community upset, but that's really not the entirety of my career or my scholarship or my friendships or my worldview. But if you read my Wikipedia entry, that's all there is. And how would Blaine and I prove to you that those stories that are now told about us are misframed? It is true there was a Spanish Inquisition. There's a whole book about it. This one is the most recommended one right now because Henry Kamen, who very interestingly was Burmese and English, right? He grew up in the Empire, the British Empire, right? And he read through all the documents the Spanish Inquisition left. And of course, if you actually read through the evidence, I mean, there is evidence out there, and we hadn't been reading it properly. Under Torquemada, about 2,000 people were burned. It's a far sight from 50 million, right? The Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, was actually not a papal inquisition. It was its own office within the Spanish kingdom. It was considered so fair that people would prefer to be tried by the Spanish Inquisition than the secular courts, because the secular courts, for example, in the Protestant kingdoms, were busy burning lots more people or hanging them, right? You've heard of the Salem witch trials. That had nothing to do with the Catholics. In its 350-year lifespan, only about 4,000 people were put to the stake by the Spanish Inquisition. Compare that, and I'm quoting here from Thomas Madden's précis of this scholarship. Tom works on the Crusades, so if you're really into the Crusades, you work on Thomas Madden. Compare that with the witch hunts that raged across the rest of Catholic and Protestant Europe, in which 60,000 people, he says mostly women, I'm not sure we actually know that properly, were executed, some of them burned, right? There was no witch craze in Spain because the Inquisition said that's nonsense. There's no such thing, right? So the Spanish actually were, the reason that we can do all of this scholarship now is you can read through all these records. If you read through all the records, you can see the degree to which, the reason it's called an inquisition is they actually ask you questions. They're inquisitors. They asked, and they actually develop in Spain proper trial procedure. So why do we think they're so bad?
Well, they do have some very attractive treasure galleons. And it would be nice to have a good excuse to send our pirates out to help themselves.
Including one of my ancestors, right? So you realize you don't get to be on the good guy's side, right? I don't get to just say, oh, I grew up in places where you can buy jewelry like this. That I grew up in the Southwest. I know what the Spanish did, for example, in Santa Fe. They founded a very nice town. Peralta was the first governor, and he had jurisdiction over the native people there, but the Spanish who settled there and were given property were not to interfere with the natives. The people that live in northern New Mexico are the ones that lived there when the Spanish arrived. You can't really say that about some of the parts of the country where the English arrived, can you? They all live in Oklahoma now, right? So you study history, you don't get to be easily on the good guy's side. And for the Spanish, what happened with the Black Legend in Spain, what Hans is saying, the Spanish, of course, are they're bad guys in the way that they're making mines and overworking their population and participating in the slave trade, which all of the Europeans did. So we could look at that. But they are very, very wealthy. They've got these treasure ships. And of course, the English at this time aren't very wealthy. The Tudors, having killed off their predecessors and asserted their authority, they're from Wales. What do you think the first thing they need to do in order to establish themselves as the proper monarchs of England is? Besides throwing off the Pope, divorcing your wife, beheading your second one, remarrying, she dies. No, wait. Taking all the property in the monasteries, burning all the statues of Our Lady. Oh, no, wait, that's not it. What do they need to do? They're an empire. Write a story, right? And what's interesting is Geoffrey of Monmouth's story gets pulled back into this. Spenser's Fairy Queen, which is the backstory model for Draco Alchemicus, which you realize we're writing against all of this, right? Our alt history is Draco Alchemicus. Incorporates, among other things, Geoffrey of Monmouth's history of Britain because the Tudors understand themselves as Welsh and therefore want to be tied to that Arthurian story. The other thing they do is read the critical dispatches that are being sent to King Charles and King Philip of Spain saying, you know, your conquistadors are misbehaving. The most famous account of this is Bartolomé de las Casas' Brief History of the Indies, in which he shows to them the atrocities that he says the conquistadors under Cortés had perpetrated. Later, Bernal Diaz comes along and says, well, de Las Casas wasn't there. It wasn't the way he tells it when we were in Cholula and those people got murdered. It was because they had tried to sabotage us, and it's complicated. But of course, that version, Diaz's version, isn't published until the 17th century. Las Casas is immediately translated into English and Dutch and every other Protestant language, published around the world, and becomes the account that you all know of how evil the Spanish were, which was in fact de las Casas's effort to say to the king of Spain, this is your responsibility as king. If these people are not being catechized properly and told stories well, they're not going to be Christian, and you're abusing children of God. I don't think I'm done yet.
But the treasure ships.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. But my ancestor, Sir John Hawkins, and his cousin, Sir Francis Drake, were really good pirates. And they stole... Actually, Sir Hawkins was first knighted by, Philip of Spain. They changed sides a few times, right? And they're very effective at stealing treasure from the ships. And Elizabeth, therefore, elevates them to admiral. They're admirals. I think Hawkins is the sub-admiral and Drake is the head admiral, to defeat, the Spanish Armada, right? So when you, and I say this, it's a funny sort of echo of my own personal history, one coming from the English side that did this, and two growing up in the part of the United States now that was Nuevo Mexico, that we are constantly caught up in these stories of empire, never mind Tartaria, right? We're constantly caught up in these stories of empire. And when I say whose empire's story are you living, recognize empires live on propaganda. And wars are fueled and enabled by effective storytelling.
But surely the glorious revolution in which we overthrew the tyranny of King James and established a constitutional monarchy based on the rights of man as delineated by John Locke, which is the ancestral origins of our recognition of human rights, and as in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, you certainly wouldn't be questioning that narrative, would you?
Where was John Locke living when he wrote the Letter on Toleration?
I don't know.
Amsterdam. Who else was living in Amsterdam? Well, the founders of New York, for one, right? The Dutch. What were the Dutch in the 17th century? The wealthiest empire in the world. The Bill of Rights is a trading agreement. It's a contract. And when William comes, so there's a long version, a short version, whatever. The short version is James II is Catholic. The English merchants and so forth. London is always a very important part of all of these stories because the power of the guilds and the merchants is extreme. They don't want a Catholic king because they're worried about what he might do in relation to, I don't know, bringing back the true faith. And so they get rid of him, bring in William of Orange, who is Dutch, William brings with him, the entire Dutch Empire, but also its practices, including bills of rights, right? The English have a Bill of Rights from 1689 is because the Dutch have already practiced making these sort of containment documents for their own stat rulers. And so 1688 is another episode in this one imperial takeover, right? And you realize, don't get comfy, because there's 1688 when the English take over the Dutch Empire. There's 1776 when we throw all the tea into the harbor, which is another good, like, deep story about where the tea is coming from. The last battle of the American Revolution, you know where it was fought? At sea off India, right? It's like we're part of the imperial story, and our empire starts when?
1776.
There's a movie out this year that says when ours does, and there's a new myth to live under and to recognize. And where did that bomb blow up? Trinity Site, New Mexico. So we are now the empire, and that should make you very, very thoughtful, and I hope prayerful about which story we're living by right now. Any questions?
We have a few minutes. We'll take some questions. Yes.
That sounds like a good plan, right? Because they'll actually talk to you. Yeah, yeah. Yep. It's so Kamen did the research. There's more research out. I mean, Henry Charles Lee in the early 19th, early 20th century actually did a lot of decent work on the archives, although he's creating some legendary versions of it. But we can see most of the people brought before the Inquisition went home, right? It's like 1% were executed. Because they kept really good records of all, right? And so it's like me and my screenshots, and it's on video and such like that. Recognize at the moment, if you're being canceled, you are to the historiography what the Spanish Inquisition has been to the Anglophone historiography. You're being canceled on lies. Yeah.
Do we have another question? Yes.
Possibly, right? So he's asking about the principalities and powers. The terrible temptation is Sauron, is the desire to dominate other wills, right? And I think my best historiography comes from my reading of Tolkien. And you see how empires work. What Sauron is trying to do with his radio tower is create, this narrative, and he does it in Numenor by telling that you'll have eternal life if you make human sacrifice to me. And then you start seeing the durable patterns of empire. They tend to include human sacrifice. And thanks be to God, Dobbs-B Jackson came down last year, and human sacrifice is no longer uncontested as a right in our current polity. But that kind of patterning, that's at another level, and that's why I say how to get history right includes your understanding of your theological perspective on causation. But the sort of durability of the patterns of the evil and the continuity of the pattern of how to stand up against this, I do see it in Christ standing up against Satan.
I'll take two more questions in the back.
On the legitimacy of which?
Aura Linda books.
I don't know those. You'll have to ask me afterwards.
Okay. You had a question?
You can take two. Okay.
What you've done here is basically purges all respectful about basically everything.
Except Christ.
Well,
Well.
so flip it around for a second. What would blow our minds that you believe to be true that you don't?
I don't know what you don't believe.
But it's conventional thought, okay, not disproved. Conventional thought. What would blow our minds?
Well, I mean, I'm not joking. I say Christ, right? And I say that my strongest, all of my historical practice has been on what's interesting about the problem with Christ is it's a historical claim, right? It's like our date, AD 2023. Time is anchored in that story. And one of the interesting things about maybe this is the level of the reason we have the historiography we do is because of Christianity, because we care as a tradition so much about the history being true. And I do talk about this in my Eurociv class with my students. It's like the reason that we have the practice of historical criticism that we do in our tradition is the absolute necessity of proving the reality of the incarnation. So it is my historical practice is grounded in that epistemological premise, and then as theologically, it means that our history is the most important thing we're doing to make sure that we're understanding the truth of our Genesis to Revelation narrative that we inhabit, which goes to Peterson's vision, right? It's like you're participating in this story.
Okay, last question. Yes.
Right. The same way. Yes, and the thing is that's, I mean, if you recognize that both sides are doing this, and there's multiple sides, and the empires are in contest with each other, and they're all creating these Darth Vader characters for you to hate. That the humbling version of that is you end up, I mean, like I joke about it. I am actually, because my grandfather, the 2-star Air Force general, did the genealogy. He found out we are directly related to Hawkins. I mean, there's thousands of other people who are too, but that you don't get to simply be proud of your side, right? And that's why I hit hard on saying, it's a theological problem, because you're trying to figure out what's good, and we live in a fallen world. So you're going to therefore have to expect people to be doing this to each other, and we pray not to be caught up in that and to be enticed into war with these sorts of vision castings.
I'm sure that Professor Brown will be happy to answer any other questions if you can catch her in the hallway, but let's give her a round of applause and thanks.